Hi, everybody. I am very excited to have this opportunity today. So, Karen McBride, she joins us today thanks to the financial assistance from the Canada Council through the Writers Union. And so, we're very grateful for that opportunity that allows us to have Karen here today. Karen McBride is an Algonquin Anishinaabe writer from the Temiskaming First Nation in the territory that is now Quebec. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Music and English, a Bachelor of Education from the University of Ottawa, and a Master of Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Toronto. Her debut novel, Crow Winter, was shortlisted for the Ottawa Book Awards, the PMC Indigenous Literature Award, and the Sunburst Award for the Canadian Literature of the Fantastic. She currently lives in Ottawa with her sister and their handsome little dog, Oscar. Thank you, Karen, for joining us today. There she is.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to actually get to see you now since we've just been communicating through email. So it's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too. This is not as good as in person, but we will certainly take it. It's better than email, I think. Crow Winter, we'll just jump right into talking about the book, if that's okay. It's your debut novel, and it's a layered, complex story, and it explores themes of family, home, Indigenous land rights, grief, and a little bit of mystery thrown in there too. Would you tell us a little bit about your book for anybody who hasn't yet had the chance to read it? Maybe tell folks a little bit about it.
For sure. I can give you my very mangled elevator pitch for my book. You'd think I'd be better at it by now, but honestly, I think I've just gotten worse. So I'll give you the best that I can do. So Crow Winter is a story that follows a young Anishinaabe woman named Hazel. She comes home to her reserve following the death of her father. She has moved home to find a way to reconcile with her grief, but also to deal with this land claims issue that's been left to her and her brother since her dad's passing. So the quarry that sits on her father's property, now her property, that's been laying dormant for over a century, is now getting more interest again. So she needs to figure that out, but at the same time, she starts having these dreams about a little trickster crow who turns out to be Nanabush, who's like a really big figure in our cosmology. And he tells her that there's more than just the land claims issue at stake with the quarry, and that the world on this side of the medicine wheel and in the spirit world is in danger. So she needs to figure all that out with his help and, I don't know, deal with her grief at the same time. So there's a lot going on, you might say.
Yes, I would say that's very true. It's an interesting story. You've just got so much going on, and yet it reads very quickly. Like I just read it almost in one sitting, just because you kind of have to know what's going to happen next. It's really quite a book. I would recommend to anybody who's watching, if they haven't read it yet, that they could pick it up from the library, or Books and Company has copies as well. So that's our local bookstore, and they have copies in stock too. So I wonder, maybe we could start, you could read a little something from the book, and then we'll go on to some more questions. I have questions, and then anybody who's in the audience, I encourage you, I don't have to take up all the time. I'm happy to take the time to read other people's questions as well. So please feel free to do that.
Okay, so the selection I'm going to read today is from chapter 2 of the book. It's called The Blue Skies. And as you can see, this is me putting my teaching degree at work. I need everyone to see the little picture I drew. Yeah, all right, so let's go right into chapter 2. The sky is always clearer here. Rows of birch, aspen, and pine stretch until their limbs touch the clouds. When the wind weaves through the trees, it's as if waves are crashing onto the shore of a sea. People here take it for granted because they haven't left this place, but I know what I'm talking about. I've been there. These leaves sound like the ocean. The Trans-Canada cuts right through the reserve, which means there's always traffic. The only gas station runs out of gas so often that it's more of a corner store. Sometimes we have to boil our water before we drink it, but that's only if pipes burst. Spirit Bear Point is far from perfect, but I don't care. It's home. A line of cars and two transports hauling logs pass too quickly along the highway that's a stone's throw from my front door. The speed limit here is 50 kilometers per hour, which feels like a crawl from the 90 kilometers per hour of the Trans Canada. But seriously, it's always made me crazy how fast people speed through the res. Just because you don't have to make any real turns to get back onto the open road doesn't mean you can speed through and hit whatever stray dog or kid is running around. The first transport's horn bellows like a steam engine as two little kids with scraped knees walking by jump up and down excitedly on the roadside. They pump their arms repeatedly to sign to the second trucker to pull his horn, but they're left disappointed. I watch as they throw obscene gestures at the back end of the transport before picking up their bikes and pushing them across the road toward the trailer park. Any more boxes left in that old Toyota? Mom is standing in the entryway. She's leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, watching me. Her face creases into a small smile. My mother, Nora Ellis, is who people envision when they think of Native women. Perfect brown skin, white, even teeth, fine lines at the edges of her eyes that are the only sign of her age. Her jaw is angled, and she has cheekbones that most people get by using makeup and a paint by numbers guide. Her dark hair pulled half back from her face means she's been in the kitchen baking beans or bannock, or maybe even both. I shake my head. Nah, this is the last one. Bring it inside. You've got a lot of unpacking to do. I don't want these boxes and bags in the front room forever, you know. I readjust the box in my arms, nudge the back door of my navy blue Toyota shut, and start for the front steps. The gravel crunches under my feet, distracting me. A crow croaks loudly on the power line above my head, startling me so much that I nearly dropped the box. I turn to look, and that black bird with its shiny feathers and dark eyes is staring right back at me. A flicker of recognition brushes my skin with goosebumps. Nanabush. Just like that, my mother has my attention. I look at her incredulously. What? She nods to the bird on the wire. He used to change into a crow. At least that's what my mother told me. You ask Karen Sutherland, though, and he'll tell you it was a rabbit. That Nanabush was always a rabbit, but I don't believe it. I think a crow's better, don't you? I keep my eyes on her a moment longer before looking up at the black bird again. It's staring down at us, tilting its little head back and forth, ruffling its feathers as it readjusts on the line when the wind picks up and shakes the wire. The crow lets out a few more caws before I look away, although I can still feel its gaze. I wonder if I've got something shiny on, but then I remember that's a magpie thing, or is that crows too? All I can think about are crows. What are they symbols of? I remember all those highly caffeinated 8:30 a.m. English literature lectures. Crows are ominous. They spell doom for the person who hears them. They're mysterious and sometimes magical, signifying intelligence, destiny. What's the nursery rhyme again? 1 for sorrow, 2 for mirth, 3 for wedding, and 4 for a birth, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, and 7 for a secret never to be told. Sorrow it is then, fitting. They remember faces too. I can hear my dad's voice in my head, echoing like a cheesy soap flashback. Crows are smarter than we give them credit for. Their memory and truth and creation. Funny how you always remember something you're trying to forget. Can't think of him now. I just got home. There'll be time for those memories later. I push him from my head, but he won't go. They're manipulative, though. Don't ever forget who the most famous crow of them all was. Shapeshifter. Trickster. Hazel? Mom's talking to me again. I turn to look at her, smile. Did you say something? I said that you came home at a good time. Weather's still nice. Come on, she says. The door shuts with a thud, setting off a soft tinkle from the magnetic República Dominicana chime that's stuck up near the top. I kick off my shoes and turn into the living room. I step over the large pile of boxes and bags, dropping the one with miscellaneous items onto the couch. The warm scent of my mother's famous baked beans invites me into the kitchen, where she's standing at the counter, the sleeves of her plaid button-down rolled up to her elbows. She's wearing a t-shirt that says, tax exempt. Supper should be ready in maybe 15 minutes. I'm just waiting on the bannock to get nice and golden. You want some lemonade? Jeez, is this a powwow feast or something? No, it's just Minute Maid. I love you, kid, but lemons were not on sale this week. Mom lifts the lid off the crock pot, scrunching her nose, and quickly replaces the cover. I watch her in the simple, easy way she moves about the kitchen. She barely has to look when she reaches up into the cupboards. Everything in here has stayed the same since my older brother was a baby. Sure, the cupboards have been repainted and the tile on the floor has been replaced, but it's still the same kitchen. It's got the same memories locked into the yellowing cabinets and the mock granite countertops. Being here is comforting and makes me feel safe. It's a relief. Coming home is my way to pause while I try to figure out the next part of my life. I don't know if that means learning how to move on, but for now, I'm happy to be here. City life has a way of devouring a person, and a year ago, right after everything went to shit, I gladly welcomed the distraction. School was my way of forgetting, ignoring all of the hurt that had built up inside me. But once I'd finished, crossed the stage, held my degree, it all rushed back into my life. I spent all of July shut up in my apartment, shifting between anger and disbelief until I couldn't stand it anymore. You glad to be home? Mom asks, brushing loose strands of hair from her eyes as she continues to adjust the flavor of the beans. I plunk myself onto one of the stools at the island and lean forward onto my elbows. Yeah, it's a nice change. I'm excited to sleep tonight without someone stomping around in the apartment above me. She says. It's a good place to recharge those old batteries, eh? She moves over to the stove and flicks on the oven light, then bends down to peer through the tempered glass at the bannock. She clicks her tongue, muttering about it taking forever. Yeah, I answer. I mean, it's not like I have anything lined up for myself here, but I guess that'll be a worry for another day. I should just shut up and enjoy the wide openness of not having to work. She straightens up as she looks at me. Weird to not be going back to school? I nod. But like, it's not like I had a whole bunch of friends there or anything. Most of the people I hung out with were Gus's friends. I'm not missing anyone, just, I don't know, the freedom and the structure. Bit contradictory there, kid, she says with a smile. Mom comes over and pulls me into a side hug. You'll be fine. Just you wait. You'll settle in, and before you know it, you'll be happy that this is your new normal again. Uh-huh. Hope you're right. She kisses the top of my head and walks back over to the counter to check on the crock pot once more. The rich, woody scent of maple syrup and liquid smoke fills the room as Mom spoons the beans into two mismatched floral patterned bowls. I watch the way her shoulders shift as she breathes in. She pauses momentarily, the wooden spoon hovering over the crock pot. She clears her throat. I'm gonna need your help picking out a monument. What? I say, caught off guard. Are you serious? Mom's moved from the counter to stand at the island across from where I'm sitting. Yeah, I don't know if I'll pick the right thing. I mean, your father was always so particular about good materials. I think if I go alone, I'll muck it up. Jesus, Mom, can't you just at least let me unpack a little before we start with this? I'm sorry, Hazel, but you being home to help with his last wishes and all has got me thinking. She places her hands on the countertop of the island and grips a little. She's doing her best to keep her emotions tucked away, but they're creeping up on her. I can't stand the thought of him lying in that place without any sign that he's there. There's grass there now, you know? It's not just some big patch of dirt anymore, but plain old stupid grass. Same kind that dogs piss on. I reach out, put my hand over top hers, and she stops talking. Go mama. It's okay. Let's just eat, all right? She nods, and I stand up to move to the table. Outside, the crow is cawing. Miigwech.
Thank you. That's, I think, a perfect introduction to life in their home. I think. I found Hazel to be such a real and well written character. She really feels like someone that I could know. I understand that you sort of both, you and Hazel, left home, lived in Ottawa, lived with a sibling even. Do you have other things in common with Hazel?
I think so. I gave her a lot of my grief. That was the really big thing I wanted to sort of let Hazel take from me and to unpack and deal with. So there's that really big thing in common that we have. I think Hazel and I have a very similar relationship with our mom. We're really close, and I think we kind of make a good little pair. And my mom likes to think she's Nora. She isn't. I've had to tell her time and time again. I'm like, no, she just has your middle name is her name. That's kind of it, Mom. But yeah, I think Hazel has those things in common with me, but she's a lot more feisty, I think, than I am. She's I don't know, more, I don't want to say outgoing, but I think I gave her a little bit more like, go get it, solve that mystery than I probably would be able to handle. Um, I think if I started dreaming about a talking crow, I might not handle it as well, but I don't know, we'll see.
So what is it like to put so much of your own life and experiences in a fictional novel?
Oh, it's a little scary, I think, at first, because I felt like I was being really vulnerable. But I just remind myself that it is fiction, and that I really, first and foremost, I'm telling a story, and I like to think a pretty important one. So it made it easier to be like draw that line between my life and her life. Um, just reminding myself that it is fiction, and that I can go ahead and pull strings and let animals talk and travel into the spirit world and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing with writing from your own experience. You can take what you have and then add to it to make sort of a more compelling story. I think the title of the book, Crow Winter, is so evocative. Within the story, it's explained what a crow winter is. But for anybody who hasn't read it or isn't familiar with the term, can you tell us what it means?
Yeah, so crow winter is a term that people use on my res. I'm not sure if other folks use it, but for sure I've heard it at home. Um, and it was my mom who actually told me about this, and it sort of like gifted me that name for the story. So the title of the book was one of the first things I had before I went into writing. So that was pretty neat and an interesting way to write, because normally my stories, I'm like, the name is the last thing on my mind. Um, Now, the thing is, I've heard two different versions of what a crow winter is. So when I first chose that title and wrote it into the book, I went with my mom's version, and then I found out there was another version. So I'll give you both of them because they kind of work nicely with the book. Like it's like a nice way to bookend the story. Okay, so my mom's version that she told me, and then the one that Nora tells Hazel in the book, is that a crow winter happens when it snows too soon in the season for it to be officially called winter. So it heralds the coming of a danger, or maybe like what sort of things can happen or destruction can happen from a too soon frost. So there's all of those lovely implications. But I also heard that crow winter means it's like the return of crows following winter. So it's talking about renewal and the beginning of spring and all of that. So, start with my mom's version and finish with this other version. I think it kind of works nicely.
Perfectly, and it goes very well with the story as well.
Mhm.
Um, so I was curious how the role of Nanabush came to be in the story and what it was like to write in his voice.
Oh, so at first I really struggled with the idea of like, do I want Nana Bush to be a real character? Or do I want him to be more like elusive and like have to a bunch more question marks around his um, realness? Um, so when I was writing the manuscript, or back then it was my MA thesis, I was working with an author who's my mentor, and she said, why don't you just write in his voice and try it out? And this is the way that you'll figure out if you want him to be in the story or not. So I did, and he sort of just took the reins and wrote himself. And the first appearance we have of Nanabush in his own voice, which I believe is chapter 7. I should know this, but anyway, his first chapter, Memories and Weeds, is the first thing I wrote in his voice. So he just, steamrolled his way right into the story. And I remember back when I was touring the book, I did an event at the Kingston Writers Festival with Dave Robertson, and he had a trickster character in his book too. And what he said is that tricksters often just come into your story and they just take away and they write themselves. And Nanabush absolutely did that with his story within the book for sure. So it wasn't too hard to get into his voice because he was just suddenly there. So it was a lot of fun, but I did kind of have to be like, okay, you need to stop. It's not just your story.
That's interesting. It's sort of it changes the tone of the book. Sometimes you're reading in his words and other times in Hazel's. Um, and so there are drawings throughout the book. And I read, and I think you mentioned that they're your drawings. Did you set out planning to do that throughout, or how did that come about?
Um, Came about again from me submitting it as my master's thesis, um, because we had to have it in a bound copy, and I didn't want to have just a boring, like, my name, my course code, and then like the date on it. I thought that was, you know, I wanted to stand out a little bit. Um, so I ended up drawing a full page sort of mock up of what I thought a cover could be, and then put a couple other little drawings to throw in at the end of the chapters, like some trees or I think I put like a crow and a piece of birch bark here and there within the thesis. And then when it was time to go chat with my publisher, I showed the pictures to my agent and was like, maybe we can like ask if we can put these in here. I was thinking like one at the beginning and maybe one at the end, or like a little, I don't know. I was not thinking the scale that ended up in the novel. So we went in, chatted with my editor, and then she brought in the art director for HarperCollins and was like, hey, what do you think of Karen's drawing? So then obviously I'm like shaking because I didn't plan on having someone like that looking at my work. Because I don't really consider myself an artist. It's more of a hobby. Like, it's not like I've ever had formal training. So as you can imagine, my palms are very sweaty. And he loved them, and so did my editor, Iris. And she said, can you maybe draw some more for us so we can put them at the beginning of every chapter? And I was floored. It was like, oh my goodness, here I was thinking, can you put in one picture? And they're like asking me to do more. So it all just kind of came together beautifully. And then I got to draw. I was like asked to draw more. I was like, of course, sure, no problem. And then I also did the crows on the cover. So the style out there matches the style on the inside. So just sort of, again, neat little bow somehow.
This seems to have come together just so perfectly. Do you think you would include drawings in a future book?
Oh, I'd love to. I think they just add something extra, and I don't know if that's just because I come from loving science fiction fantasy writing, and oftentimes in fantasy books you get like a whole map of the world, and I'm biting off more than I can chew. Really wanted to put a map in Crow Winter, but then I was like, maps are hard to draw. I am not a cartographer. So I changed my mind and was like, you're just gonna have to picture it yourself. But I would love to do that in a future book. I think there's just something special about having those little like flourishes in it, and it brings more to the story. Like they do in Crow Winter, they often tell you a little bit about what the chapter is going to be about, and when you finish it or get partway through, you're like, oh, I see what that is, or it's like little Easter eggs, I think.
Yeah. And it sort of gives a little bit of flavor of each chapter.
Mm-hmm.
That was really interesting. So speaking of sort of science fiction and fantasy, I've read your book described as magical realism. Is that a term that resonates with you for your book, or how do you prefer to see it described?
That's a good question, because when I first went into all of the whole publishing world, I thought, yeah, that makes sense for what I'm writing. And that's what I've loved to read, like people like Neil Gaiman, that very much magic realism. And I love the idea, or urban fantasy. That's another one where it's like in the city and magical stuff happens. Like, I think that's just so fun. Um, but I've also seen some discourse talking about Indigenous literature and saying like that doesn't really fit for us because it isn't magic. It's more like this is our reality. So it's much more like this is just what our worldview is. So it's like a give and take sort of scenario. Like, I think if that's the way that leads you into the book and gets you learning more about what Indigenous literature is, then that's great. So no, I think it's this like sits on the edge of that definition, and then on working with Indigenous cosmology and all that fun stuff.
That's I think why it stuck out to me when I read it described that way. I thought, I wonder if she would agree with that. So that's interesting. As a not Indigenous person myself, I found that the way you wove the culture throughout so interesting. And in some ways, Hazel's discovering some of this for herself. Like, I'm thinking specifically when she goes to the sweat lodge. it's all sort of new to her. So someone like me, where I've, hadn't read a first person experience quite like that before, you feel like you're experiencing it with her for the first time. How did you strike the balance of sort of not making it an Indigenous Culture 101 book, but really a rich story that is accessible to everyone?
Um, I sort of approached it as organically as possible. I tried to remember what it was like when I first went to a sweat because um, growing up, my parents didn't really practice their culture, and their parents didn't really either. It was um, not necessarily allowed. So we typically kept it on like the DL. So a lot of people my age are sort of just rediscovering what it is to be Indigenous, to be Anishinaabe. Um, so it was very much like I was writing my own experience there and thinking in that mindset that like maybe this will be someone's first experience with it. Some both Indigenous or non-Indigenous person reading it and saying, wow, okay, that's what that's like. And especially if you are a First Nations person looking at the representation of the sweat, which is not like a catch-all way that a sweat is performed. It was just the way I experienced it, and also the way I had permission to tell it, because we have to follow protocol when it comes to ceremony. But yeah, it was really important for me to give it a very real and true, authentic um, space to exist. Um, so it could really show you that like this is something that's still happening, that we are still timidly coming into understanding and being proud of who we are, because it can be a scary experience. Like I know when I first made my first regalia, I was so intimidated because I had a lot of colonialist thoughts, settler world thoughts in my head, that like I am much more pale than a stereotypical view of what an Indigenous person is. And I thought people are not going to accept me, but that could not be further from the truth. And that whole thinking was framed just by that settler sort of view of what it meant to be Indigenous. So it was important to me to include that in the narrative, and let Hazel like take her time getting reconnected with herself, with her community, and with the land, just to show that you can take your time with it, and that every way that you approach it, no matter how tiny or small that practice is, that it is important, that it's a way of reclaiming who you are.
Would you say that your use of language is also part of that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it was so important to me to include language in there. I'm not fluent by any means in Anishinaabe. I wish I was. I'm working towards it now, and I needed it to exist. It had to take up space to even just seeing it on the page is this sort of act of pushing against losing that culture and losing our languages, because they are in danger. So it was this little like defiance, like, no, it's there, it's written, it's printed, it's all over the country. So that was really exciting, just to see the way I experience language in there, and the way that my res experiences language. Like for the longest time, I thought the word animizi was a word that everybody knew. My sisters too, because we were using it in our household all of the time. And then we went to high school in Ontario, because our res does border Quebec and Ontario. So that was the closest English speaking high school. And they went to school and said it to somebody, and they were like, what did you just say? So can imagine it was a fun day for them, being like, what, how do people not know this? And then it also doesn't really translate to English. So even then, trying to explain it, like I've tried multiple times to be like, this is what animism means, and I don't know if I'm getting close to using it, saying it properly in English. But all that to say that putting language in there was so important to me, that it had space to exist, to live, to breathe, and to be read and then said and learned, because there is that glossary at the end for you to flip back and forth, or even just skim over, because I've actually had talks with some of my friends who read the book and been like, I didn't even know that glossary was there until I finished the book. So I was just like accepting that I didn't know what that meant. And that was, that's part of the reason that I threw it at the end and didn't put like a footnote, was so you are experiencing the language and feeling either a disconnect or a connect with it. And I'm a teacher and I can't help it but try to teach stuff. So
I think it's very successful. I didn't notice the glossary till I got to it. And so reading along, you just sort of, oh, and sort of in context, you can pick up the gist of it. And then when you get to the end, you're able to sort of, okay, I was right about what that meant in context, or oh, I didn't quite have that one exactly, so that it really it adds to the richness, I think, of the story. Um, so a big part of the mystery involves Hazel reading through old letters to and from the Indian agent for her area around the quarry. So these letters stood out to me when I was reading. And although it's fiction, they seemed like they must be based in reality to me. Was my hunch correct on that?
yeah, absolutely. I used to work in land claims with my sister as a summer student. So my job was literally Hazel's job, to sit there and read through old letters and like correspondence between the Indian agent and then Indian Affairs, which what it was called back in the day, um, about all kinds of things. And like when she mentions talking about a fence at one point, that there was like 10 letters about who was right on the land, or all of that stuff. Like those were legitimate and made for very long afternoons at work, as I'm sure you can imagine. But yeah, so I had a lot of experience with that kind of historical writing. And then I also had a little in on with my sister to be like, can I see a letter? How would this sound? And to work with it. And I was able to actually like pass them by her and say, like, does this look legitimate? And she said yes. So I got the green light from my historical researcher sister.
That's good. But I think it comes through in the letters. And so similarly, one of the aspects that stood out to me is the way you describe the band office. So there are certain elements that I just thought, I feel like I've been to this place. You talk about, oh, well, there was funding in, was it 1967? So this part got updated. And then another part where you talk about, oh, well, there's a buffalo skull. Of course, we didn't have buffalo in this area, but, you know, can you, like, how did that detail, it must have come from somewhere. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, describing the band office was one of my favorite things I think to do in the book. I just love the idea of this like monolithic building on a res, just feeling like both very much a part of it, but then kind of out of place because it is so ridiculously big. Um, like you said, there was funding and then they ran out. So I think I just talk about the different kinds of wood that it's made of. Like they had imported cedar, and then it was like, oh shoot, we don't have enough to finish this wing, so we're going to use another cedar but color it. So it's just a play on how funding works and how it can like just be taken out from under you. But you're a library, so you guys understand. But the whole idea of the buffalo skull and Hazel's commentary in that section is sort of a pushback against pan-indigeneity and pan-indigenousness, which is a problem where we sort of take all of our beautiful indigenous different groups and put them under one umbrella. And then we lose all of those finer points, the details of the painting. So she makes that comment about the skull being like, we didn't have those, so why is that here? But it's just like, oh, it's generic, let's put it up. So it just gave her that second to like make that commentary and to talk about how it's important that we acknowledge the things that make us who we are, and that also we don't appropriate from other cultures. That goes back to her saying at the beginning, I always thought it would be Raven who would teach me, because that's who she heard of more in school, and whoever was telling those stories, they were always about Raven. I'm sorry, my dog's next to me. He's dreaming right now, so if you hear it, I'm sorry. Got really distracted. Anyway, yeah, so she starts off by saying, no, this is like, it is an Anishinaabe story. And again, the whole band office thing was an important moment for her to set in stone, like this is Anishinaabe, Algonquin Anishinaabe story, not this pan-Indigenous story.
Do you think that people are becoming more aware of that, or do you think that we're still sadly lacking in that area?
I think we're moving toward knowing more about that and understanding the differences between everybody, um, and the importance of acknowledging that. I think we're on our way, but I think there's still quite a ways to go. It's hard to say. I think for myself, just because I am surrounded by people who are Indigenous all the time, so I don't really have these big conversations. Um, but I don't know. I want to be positive and say, yes, people are understanding more. And I think books like mine and Eden Robinson, Cherie Dimoline, and then also nonfiction like Helen Knott and Alicia Elliott, like these are so important that you're reading these experiences that are unique or specific to a certain place, a time, and a person, to really understand those beautiful complexities and, you know, broaden your horizons.
I can certainly say from the perspective of our library, we have had such a demand for books by Indigenous authors over the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, and it's really, it's amazing to see. All of a sudden, it's like people realize there's this whole breadth of literature out there that they maybe hadn't seen before. So, I think
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just one story. It's not one story about trauma and all of those really sad truths. Like, we're not just the legacy that Canada has left for us. We are so much more. We have beautiful stories about heartbreak, but about joy as well. And I think it's so important that we lift up those stories about joy, and not just for all our readers, but just specifically for Indigenous youth. You know, they deserve to see themselves in a positive light and exciting ways. Like Dave Robertson has a series about an Indigenous superhero. Like, how cool is that? Like, I want more of that. Anyway, sorry to just completely interrupt you as you're chatting.
yeah, no, I completely agree. We know how important that representation is and telling those stories. And that's one of the things that's so amazing about your book, I think, is it really brings you into that story. Like she's really, Hazel is really interacting and involving this character that, otherwise, how to exactly say this, you might otherwise read a little bit about, oh, and then they have this character of Nana, but you might think that's interesting, I guess, and put it aside. But when it's part of your novel and he's a real character, it brings it to life in a way that I think an academic reading might not. So I can say I appreciated that. One more thing I wanted to ask you about your writing process. So the book slips between sort of the past and the present, and Hazel's voice and Nana Bush's voice, and then a little bit of mystery too. How do you plot out a story that's that complex?
Oh, what did I do? Okay, so I wish I had some really smart insight for you here, but I am so totally that writer that's like, okay, I think I know where I want to go. I'm just gonna sit down and figure it out. I wrote the book even chronologically, like that. Don't do that if you're gonna write. Like, don't chain yourself to that idea. You're not locked into like you have to write chapter one. You can't. If you have an idea for the end, go write the end. But for some reason, I was like, no, start from the beginning. Um, I was lucky again to be writing this during school, so I had deadlines. I had grades that were dependent on it, and I had a mentor. So it was really nice to have all of these things that made sure I sat down and I wrote and I had accountability. Um, so that was a big important part of the process. And the way I worked with my mentor, Susan Swan, was I would write, I'd send her stuff, I'd go to her house and we'd sit there and she would just ask me questions. And so she really led me um, into like the next part of the story or into the conclusion, because I told her where I wanted it to go, and she really like sort of like laid these little seeds, and I watered them and let them grow. Um so yeah, I don't even think I have a map, like even point form for this one. And I'm not saying that to be like, wow, look how talented I am. It's more like, I don't do that. Leave yourself clues, plan it out if you can. That's what I'm doing with my next novel. So learning from my mistakes the first time around, that like I always have an idea going in, and it formulates, and I actually wrote it down this time, and then I'm hoping to, I don't know, carve out some time and sit down and pretend I have deadlines. I do have deadlines, but I need to pay attention to them and not procrastinate, because I'm a really good procrastinator too.
I think with this being your debut book, you sort of set yourself a really high bar for the future.
I
So
know.
what's your next, can you tell us anything about your next book? Are you in a place
Um,
to say?
yes, I can. So I'm working on fiction for sure. I have a little nonfiction thing I need to get done too, but the fiction is probably leaning a little bit more YA, but I think very accessible to everybody. It's a story about four friends over the course of the summer, more mystery and um, fantastical elements that will come into play. Um, think of it as like Stranger Things, but like on the res in a way. I think that's like my mood board. So like Stranger Things kind of. Yeah, that's the plan.
And is it set in the past or is it set currently?
I'm struggling with that right now because part of me really wants to set it in the 90s or like early 2000s, because that's when I grew up. And I don't know if that's just me being selfish and wanting to throw in all of those like early 2000s references. But then I thought, oh my God, the fashion is so bad. I can't do that to those poor kids. So I'm not sure just yet. It's kind of like in an in between right now, but it'll be fairly modern, if not occurring like now, but not a pandemic story for sure.
That it's interesting. I've talked to a number of authors since the pandemic, and they either seem to fully embrace it and are dying to write about it because it's such an unusual time, or they're like, no, thank
Like,
you.
no.
I don't want any of that. It's really changed a lot of writing for people from, I talked to one author who said, how do I write a party scene? How do we even get in a room with people and talk to them? I don't know. So that's interesting. I wouldn't blame you for avoiding it.
Oh, for real. Even watching TV now, if I'm watching something and there's like a crowd scene, I get anxious. And I'm like, look how close they are. Why aren't they wearing masks? So I couldn't even imagine writing a pandemic story that wasn't like a zombie story, which is different. Like I could probably have fun with a zombie story, but even then I think it's a little too close to home right now. So it's a no for me.
I don't blame you. So you mentioned some of the authors that you like, but being the library, that's one of our favorite questions to ask. What are you reading now, or what would you recommend to people who have finished your book and they're looking for something else to read?
Okay. For recommendations for people who have finished my book, and if you haven't already read Eden Robinson's Trickster trilogy, absolutely go there. Um, and also watch any interview with her. She's so funny. Was lucky enough to get to chat with her, and I had the best time. So she's hilarious. I think Cherie Dimeline, her Marrow Thieves is a good place to go too. They kind of all sort of live in that zone. But in terms of what I'm reading, I've been reading a lot of nonfiction right now. I don't know if that's because I'm craving some kind of different reality, but also kind of reality. I'm a huge space nerd. I don't know if that was obvious because I'm wearing a NASA shirt and I have a star ship behind me. So I've been reading, what did I read? Black Hole Survival Guide by Jan 11 is really fun. Also, it's a really pretty little book. Let me show you. Look at this. It's like little, and it like has this lovely cover, and there's illustrations, which checks like all of my boxes. So that's great. And I'm also reading Star Talk by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and The End of Everything by Katie Mack, which is talking about how the universe is going to end, astrophysically speaking. So really big, scary concepts, but it's kind of nice to be like, oh, that is so far in the future. That's a different kind of world ending. So that one's fun too.
Well, that certainly gives people some different titles to try. And it's interesting. Some people who are writing, that I've talked to, some authors, when they're writing fiction, they only like to read nonfiction. in case the fiction sort of bleeds into their writing. I don't know if that's something that you experience.
I think so because when I was writing Crow Winter, one of my big inspirations was Neil Gaiman's American Gods because I loved that idea of like this old god being like, I don't know where I fit in anymore. So that really is reflected in Nana Bush's story. Like he is looking for his place and like is like, I don't know where I fit in, and I'm tired. So I love that idea of this really tired old god that's like, I no one even pays attention to me anymore. I just want to chill. So I thought that was really neat. So I had to be careful to avoid that writing, so to make sure I wasn't like suddenly writing American Gods, which that's like a big ask, but still wanted to make sure I wasn't getting into that territory. But there are a few nods to it, and if you're if you read fantasy and sci-fi like I do, you might have noticed other little references that I put in there as well. There's some Game of Thrones stuff. There's Lord of the Rings references. If you found it, you probably are right.
Oh, that's great. Well, this has just been such a fun conversation. And to everybody who's watching, if you haven't picked the book up yet, I recommend that you do. We've got copies at the library and also, of course, at Books and Company, because it's well worth reading, and it's a read that will keep you turning the pages throughout, I think. So thank you very much. And thank you. I want to say thank you to Karen for joining us, and also the Canada Council through the Writers Union, where we had the financial assistance to allow her to join us. So we really appreciate that as well. Great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been great. I had such good questions, and I always love talking about all kinds of things, not just what I wrote, but all of the fun book and dorky stuff in between. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much.